that's just been published, Buying National Security, How America Plans and Pays for Its Global Role and Safety at Home. The co-authors are Gordon Adams, who's a professor in the School of International Service at American University, also a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center, and Cindy Williams, who's a principal research scientist in the Security Studies program at MIT. Gordon wrote a fair bit of this book, and it was his project at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and he and Cindy held a number of workshops that sort of fed into this book. So we're delighted that it's come to fruition. This publication has been published and is available at a popular price just outside this door for inscription by the authors. And we're delighted to have two distinguished practitioners, Ambassador Mark Grossman, who's currently a public policy scholar here at the center, and the Honorable Dov Zakheim, who's the former Undersecretary of Defense, the Comptroller of the Pentagon, to offer kind of practitioner perspectives on the publication. The format will be that Gordon and Cindy will provide an overview of the book, and then we'll turn to our two commentators, which will be followed by a discussion which will open it up for your comments and even questions. Gordon, I take it you're going to lead off? Cindy's going to lead off. Let me give a little fuller introduction of our two principals here. Cindy Williams, as I mentioned, is in the Security Studies program at MIT. Her work there includes an examination of the processes by which the U.S. government plans for and allocates resources among the activities and programs related to national security and international affairs. That's this project. A study of options for reform of military personnel policies, and an examination of the transition to an all-volunteer force in the militaries of several European countries. Formerly, she was Assistant Director of the Congressional Budget Office, where she led the National Security Division in studies of budgetary and policy choices related to defense and international security. So, Cindy, floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Rob, and thanks to the Wilson Center for making this project possible, both by hosting Gordon and by hosting our workshops as we went along, and just by giving us encouragement as we hit tough spots. The U.S. government is going to spend about $840 billion this year on activities aimed at advancing American interests abroad and promoting security at home. These include defense, homeland security, intelligence, diplomacy, and foreign assistance at a minimum. The choices about how much money we spend and about how the money gets spent, what it gets spent on, are some of the most important decisions our national leaders make. And at bottom, these budget choices are the clearest representation we have of the nation's security strategy. Until now, the mechanics of how a lot of these choices were made were largely a mystery, even to people who participated in the process of making them. So Gordon and I set out to write Buying National Security because we wanted to unravel that mystery at every level. That means in the departments and agencies that are making plans and developing budgets internally, in the National Security Council and the Office of Management and Budget in the White House as they work on strategies and formulate budget guidelines, and in Congress as lawmakers formulate their own budget plans and exercise their oversight responsibilities. Gordon and I, back in the day, both cut our teeth on defense processes that were internal to the defense budget. And I have to say, we grew up with an understanding that's prevalent throughout the Defense Department that budgets and money ought to be connected. Budgets and strategy ought to be connected in some way. That there should be some effort at a disciplined process that helps you make choices among the various priorities. And there ought to be some effort at a rational process that takes you from what national leaders say they want down to what's in the budget. I'd have to say that both of us complained for decades about the flaws in the defense process. But now that we've looked at the processes in other departments and other agencies, gotten a better handle on what goes on the Hill and in the White House, when you're talking about other the other agencies and departments that relate to national security. Those other processes make defense budgeting look like a model of rationality and discipline. I'm going to focus my remarks on defense and then on homeland security, and then Gordon's going to talk about some examples that he came up with on the intelligence side and in foreign affairs, and also in the interlinking between defense and foreign affairs. And then, of course, we'll follow with our commentators, who already have warned me that they found dozens of mistakes in the book, so listen up to them. So let me start with the Department of Defense process. It's now called Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution, or PPBE. It was first put in place by the late Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara back in the Kennedy years. At the time, that system, the PPBE, seemed revolutionary, and using it allowed Secretary McNamara to surface important information about the cost and the effectiveness of the nation's weapons programs. And based on that information, the Secretary actually made some major shifts of resources between the Air Force and the Navy. Since then, defense's processes have been adjusted multiple times, to the point where some would say they barely recognize the old McNamara system inside the current PPBE. But I would have to say one thing we discovered was that the process for the base budget, that is the non-war part of the defense budget, is still one of the most rational in the security realm, even though, of course, it has its problems. Unfortunately, defense's process for putting together its war budget since 9/11 has been the very opposite of rigorous and rational. The Bush administration relied on emergency supplemental appropriations for most of its war funding, and the supplemental budgets were handled almost completely outside of the normal PPBE. One of the results of skirting the PPBE was that substantial amounts of spending attributed to the wars was actually largely unrelated to the wars. For example, more than 20% of the department's procurement funding since 2001 came through the war budgets. A lot of that money went not to replace equipment that was battered in the wars, but to fill shortfalls that existed well before the wars started. The Obama administration is working to instill more of the PPBE style of discipline into its war budgeting, but it's not clear yet how successful it's going to be. For example, Secretary Gates's request for the wars in fiscal year 2011 includes money for an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter that seems utterly unrelated to the current wars. So if you want to pick up Buying National Security, it's Chapter 5 that treats the processes in the Department of Defense today. Now I'm going to turn to Homeland Security. Homeland Security is arguably the least understood of the security budgeting processes today, if only because the Department of Homeland Security is so new. As you might recall, after the terrorist attacks of 2001, President Bush appointed Tom Ridge as a Homeland Security so-called czar. They called him the director of the Office of Homeland Security in the White House. The czar had no authority over budgets for the multiple agencies and departments that had parts of the Homeland Security puzzle inside the federal government. And critics argued that the czar's position was therefore too weak, that a new federal department was needed. Only a cabinet secretary, they said, would be able to wield the budget tool in a way that would allow him to shift money from low priority areas of work into high priority programs that would best reduce the risk of terrorism. And in 2002, as you know, Congress created the Department of Homeland Security, and Tom Ridge became the department's first secretary. He had then purview over the budgets of the 22 formerly separate agencies that joined the department. Soon after the department opened its doors in 2003, the Secretary's senior staff established a PPBE of its own, a planning, programming, budgeting, execution system that was modeled loosely after the one in the Department of Defense. Their process in the Department of Homeland Security had all the bells and whistles of rational resource allocation. It had a planning phase at the front end, so the Secretary could articulate his priorities to the components. It had a programming phase where the operating components could develop their 5-year plans and their 5-year budgets that should have been consistent with the Secretary's priorities. It had a program review conducted by the Secretary's staff to make sure that the components' plans and budgets were consistent with his guidance. And it had a budgeting phase to scrub the numbers and get the budget ready for the Secretary to send to the White House. 7 years and hundreds of billions of dollars later, we find precious little evidence of a Secretary of Homeland Security actually using that budget tool to shift money from low priority activities into high priority activities, or to get rid of redundant programs. In fact, the most powerful budget tool we've seen the Secretary use is what I would call the constant shares calculator. Each of the legacy components gets almost exactly the same share of the total budget pie as it did before the department was created. That same tool, the constant shares calculator, would have been just as easy to use in the absence of a new department. Part of the reason no money shifted among the operating components was that for all of its bells and whistles, the system the department established actually lacked teeth at crucial points. So, for example, the Secretary never even signed, in the early years, never signed his own planning guidance. This is the guidance to the components to tell him what his top priorities were. Planning guidance went to the components, but it went unsigned, and the components treated it like a document that was unsigned, one that basically had no teeth. On top of that, the organization that was charged with analyzing the potential costs and the consequences of broad policy trade-offs across multiple operating components was staffed with inexperienced people, and they were overburdened with other work. Another reason for the problem in the Department of Homeland Security lies at the White House level, because the Homeland Security Council at the White House never really settled on a clear assessment of priorities and risks. The strategy documents proliferated. There were dozens of them, but they offer little concrete guidance to the budget planner who's trying to decide whether to add more funding for passenger screening or put more money toward port security. Congress also plays a role in this story. Shortly after the new department was established, the Appropriations Committee in each chamber created a Homeland Security subcommittee that had jurisdiction over the Department of Homeland Security. But the same thing didn't happen on the authorizing side. No single authorizing committee holds jurisdiction over the department's policy. And instead, in both the House and the Senate, policy oversight of the department is still fractured among the numerous subcommittees and committees that held jurisdiction of the legacy components before 2003. This leaves the operating components with multiple back doors to lawmakers anytime they disagree with the Secretary's priorities. All of those things eroded the clout that people imagined the budget tool might give to a Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, some of those factors have been changing in recent years. The department's leaders have engaged more actively in the planning process. They've signed the guidance over the past couple of years. The department strengthened its Office of Program Analysis and Evaluation. That office has actually conducted some trade-off studies now that go across the operating component lines. But again this year, constant shares seems to be the tool of choice for the DHS budget. If you compare this year's budget with the budget in 2003 or the budgets of the legacy components before the department was even formed, it's almost the exact same shares among the operating components. And Chapter 7 in Buying National Security talks about resource allocation for Homeland Security. If you're interested in the congressional processes, they're in Chapter 9. I'm going to turn it over to Gordon now and ask Gordon to talk about a little bit about budgeting for intelligence and foreign affairs.
Thanks, Cindy, and thanks to the Wilson Center from my point of view, too. I had the absolutely felicitous and happy 11 months here working largely on this manuscript, my part of this manuscript.
Gordon, I was introducing each speaker in turn, and
Go ahead.
I gave, as they say in the recording industry, the extended play version of Cindy's bio to the audience, and I'd like to do the same for you.
Okay, go ahead.
I'd like to mention you've held a number of positions in academia, At the Elliott School, you were the deputy director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Perhaps most pertinent to this discussion, you were associate director for national security and international affairs at the Office of the Management and Budget, and was essentially the senior White House budget official for national security. So you're a bona fide expert. Over to you.
We're in deep trouble. I'm grateful to you, Rob, particularly for your collegial relationship that we had when I was working here and since, but to Lee Hamilton and Mike Van Dusen as well. And there are some people I see sprinkled out in the audience that I enjoyed working with while I was here. Don Wolfensberger, I see at the end of the table, and John Sewell over the other side of the table somewhere. Where are you, John? There he is in the back. Kent Hughes, I see over in the corner. It's great to be back. This is a wonderful place for any of you who have an ambition to spend time really being able to focus on the thing that you love doing. And I enjoyed doing it while I was here. From our perspective, a couple of general points. Budgets are policy. Our two commentators know that probably better than anybody else in their practitioner fields. But by and large, everybody runs from budgets, and very few people study them. So one of the reasons we wrote this book is because the literature on the planning and budgeting process for national security scarcely exists unless it's PowerPoint briefing by the Defense Department on PPBE. There just isn't a lot of good literature on the subject. And in our view, at least, what we wanted to try to do here was to provide a perspective on budgeting and planning for national security and foreign policy across the full range of institutions and processes involved. Today, in a world dominated by issues of interagency relationships and interagency problems, we thought that having a single compendium that pulled all of those together in one place filled a gaping gap in the literature. I mean, I still remember Sidney's my first conversation about this book several years ago. I won't say how many, but several years ago, saying, there's nothing out there. There is no literature like this. Why don't we write it? In part, that's driven by the fact that both of us now teach, and having something to assign to a class other than the sort of raw documents that the government puts out when a budget comes out, there was no literature to assign. And so we wanted something, but getting the tools together is important right across the policy process. It's not only important for scholars and academics and think tank analysts, but it's also important, we think, for practitioners on the Hill, practitioners in the executive branch who are trying to wrestle to the ground just exactly how the entire United States government plans and provides resources to its national security requirements. I wanted to say, make basically three short points. One, briefly in passing to round out the summary that Cindy provided. There's also virtually no literature on intelligence budgeting. The only thing that is of any length was a consultant report that is regularly updated and pretty good, but written very much for the intelligence budget processor inside the intelligence world itself. Outside of that, the main text on the intelligence community by Mark Lowenthal has a whole 4 pages on the way budgeting is done for intelligence. So the difficulty of getting your arms around process is nowhere near as great as the difficulty of getting your arms around the programs and the numbers, which are, of course, classified until released now under law in the aggregate. But this book, I think, is the only place you'll find a discussion of why it is so hard for the ODNI, even in the post-9/11 environment, to get his arms around the government's full intelligence effort. The intelligence world with 16 agencies is pretty much a interagency problem all of its own that the ODNI has to try to get his arms around. A major feature in the book, and one of the issues that I think, at least for me, was very important in doing it, is that there are 3 chapters on international affairs budgeting. This, to my knowledge, may be the only literature extant on how international affairs budgeting has been done, at least since the long since published book that my friend and colleague Bill Backus wrote some years ago on the subject of foreign policy budgeting. I appreciate your being here, Bill. The book discusses the problem of budgeting in the international affairs or foreign policy world in detail, and it takes 3 chapters to do it. When I was at OMB, I discovered that while 90% of the resources for which I was responsible were over in what they call Function 050 or National Defense, 90% of my SURUS, that's a technical term, was in the international affairs world. And the reason is the diaspora of agencies and the absence of strategic planning and budgeting processes in that world. It meant that things came together at my desk, which was a miserably painful place to have them come together. So the problem is one of diaspora, of capabilities, institutions, processing, budgets. There's nothing like what Cindy described, the PPBS system in the foreign policy world. And there are valiant efforts over the last couple of decades to try to find some coherent planning process. The RPP exercise, Richard Armitage was probably one of the strongest deputy secretaries in focusing on managing and budget planning processes. Secretary Rice created a new foreign assistance process, the F office at the State Department, which fell into some ill repute with some folks in the foreign policy community. And capping it off, I think, with probably what is the most strong effort that I have seen yet undertaken by the department and USAID, which started with the appointment of filling a job that had been empty and vacant for 10 years and had never been filled since it was created, of a Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources. Stunning turn of events with a very competent Jack Lew in charge of it. And as a consequence of that, the very first ever quadrennial diplomacy and development review happening in the Department of State and USAID. Now, this process is still underway, so it's a little bit early to judge how thorough, how complete, how much like PPBS it would be. But it's focusing on capabilities. I've said publicly that I'm urging them in the QDDR process to focus on strategy and mission too, as well as capabilities, because you need capabilities for particular strategies and missions. And Ambassador Grossman, who I'm delighted to have here, and I have talked numerous times on the subject of human resources in the foreign policy community. And it's not just a question in international affairs of adding people and money. They need to be set in a context which enables state and USAID to be effective in dealing with the challenges of the 21st century. And that's as much a question of strategy and mission as it is a question of the capabilities that follow from it. Thirdly, the book also explores the White House and interagency process for planning and budgeting, such as it is. Outside of the Office of Management and Budget, any process is uneven and accidental, and the OMB process is not truly interagency. So it's not a very together set of assets for the president. It's very hard to set priorities. It's very hard to provide guidance at the senior level. It's hard to focus and set priorities and choose capabilities. And we focus at the end of the book, in the final chapter, on some reforms that we propose at that level, because the interagency is, in fact, where it's at in the modern world. And so we do explore in the security assistance chapter and in the security assistance chapter, in fact, two particular areas where the interagency process, both inside state and at the interagency level, is important, and that is security assistance and post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization programs. Here, the questions of authorities, money, interagency relationships are paramount. The absence of flexibility in the security assistance authorities at state, the absence of a civilian deployment capability at state. We examine both of these in the book. And I want to come back in closing just to that issue for a moment, because the question, and this question of mission, is very important here. That what the State Department and USAID in the QDDR need to grapple with is the mission of the civilian agencies. We hear a lot of bumper stickers in Washington about whole of government, and this book is indeed a lot of whole of government literature. But that said, we need a civilian mission and vision and capability in the U.S. government, not one designed solely to support deployed U.S. military forces, but on the civilian basis, looking at the problems of governance and state building, which is the key security problem that we face today. So getting ahead of the curve on fragile states, anticipating and preventing conflict, are, I would suggest, part of that mission. And governance and state building aren't particularly core military functions, but they are core problems, as we say in the book. And the state will need to do a lot more to build this civilian capability. And I would suggest will depend less on the U.S. military for what it does with that capability than on allies, friends, regional powers, international organizations, NGOs, and the like. Inevitably, there's a kinetic side to this. Security issues, stabilization elements, which is a capability DoD can provide. But it's less central and less demanding once you decide that the problem is not what is the lesson of Iraq and Afghanistan, but what is the fragile state problem. than the large build-up capability that we're doing at DoD is making today, which draws on Iraq and Afghanistan. So what we've tried to do, rather than urge some of the policy directions here, is to talk about baseline information and data on the authorities, institutions, programs, and budgets. I'm delighted to be associated with the Stimson Center as well before the book came out and since, because the budgeting for foreign affairs and defense program at the Stimson Center is looking at precisely those things: authorities, institutions, programs, budgets in the defense and foreign policy world, and the importance of balancing and rebalancing the toolkit of national security. So we hope the book helps provide a baseline that informs debates and discussions, educates across capabilities, budget processes, and the like, and will play a role in what needs to be done today to strengthen these processes, both within agencies and across agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. We'll turn now to our two commentators, who are both practitioners. Ambassador Mark Grossman, as I mentioned, is a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center. He's also vice chairman of the Cohen Group. In 2005, he completed a distinguished career at the State Department, where he was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Director General of the Foreign Service, also served as the U.S. Ambassador to Turkey. So, Mark, thank you. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first, let me say how pleased I am to be part of the Woodrow Wilson Center family here, at least for a short time. I very much appreciate it. And I suspect that over the next 5 or 10 minutes, I will now prove to you all the things that Gordon said about State Department people and Foreign Service officers not knowing anything about budgets, but we'll see. It's an honor to be part of this event, and I just really want to congratulate Gordon and Cindy on this book. It is a tremendous achievement and something, as they said, that is really very important and I think will be used for a long time in the future. And I'm also delighted to be on this panel with Dov. Dov, nice to see you. Thank you very much. This attempt to define this way that the national security budget is created and divided is, as both the authors said, extremely important, not just because it's hard to understand or we might be able to assign these to our classes, but of the importance of this to the United States of America. And so I'd like to just focus for my comments, if I could, on the 150 budget, looking at the State Department, AID, foreign assistance. And I start with this thought, which is that diplomacy, and here I say smart power and not soft power, is, in my view anyway, more important than ever. And I think that's a nonpartisan statement. I think what Americans wish for is more diplomacy rather than less diplomacy. And to do that, I recognize two things. First of all, that engagement is not the same thing as diplomacy. You need a larger, more comprehensive diplomatic strategy. And secondly, that diplomacy is not the answer to every question. You need the strongest defense possible. But we've got to think about these new threats that face our country, allies, friends, and diplomacy. And I think that diplomacy, as a tool of national security, will be more important than ever into the future. And the book talks about some of these ideas, and some of them are here on discussion at the Wilson Center, about the continuing need to defeat extremism, questions of nonproliferation, living sustainably on the planet, dealing with pre- and post-conflict situations, as both Gordon and Cindy talked about, questions of demography, which include crime and narcoterrorism, global health, all point to the need for more rather than less diplomacy. And the question that this book poses, and the question that the book wrestles with, is whether we have the instruments, or as Gordon very rightly put it, the capabilities, and the will to fund the instruments that we need, not the instruments that we have, to create 21st century diplomacy. And I think that, as Gordon said, and I would have said in public, is that this isn't a matter of being in favor of more for more's sake, which I am not. I think the very welcome additional funds directed to the State Department over the past 3 years, if those funds are used to prop up the same jobs and the same institutions and the same way of looking at problems that we've had over the past 30 years, then the taxpayers haven't been that well served. Like Gordon and Cindy both said, you recognize that there's been change over the past 10 or 15 years, important change in the way people think about their jobs and do their jobs. And you can see it, I think, in the Millennium Challenge Corporation, in the Proliferation Security Initiative, in new ways of thinking about diplomacy. But it's key, as Gordon and Cindy do in the book, to push along these changes and make them go farther and make sure that the right changes are then fully funded. talk for a minute about human resources, because I think it's key to everything else. During most of my career at the State Department, the department was crushed by a lack of human resources. And of course that began to change during the Bush administration, first with the Diplomatic Readiness Initiative, and then Secretary Rice's effort to get more people into the department. And I think it's no coincidence, and a very important part of the point of this book about national security and whole of government, that among the most eloquent voices for more money for more people for the State Department, starting in January of 2008 at CSIS, was the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, who said there's you can't have one answer to all questions. And it led then to a number of people who were able then to look at the CSIS study called the Embassy of the Future, or one that Gordon participated in called the Foreign Affairs Budget of the Future, which I think played crucial roles in pushing this issue out into the public and then getting it over a tipping point. And you had the first Obama and Clinton budgets, which followed the last budgets of Secretary Rice and President Bush, to put more human resources into the department. And Secretary Clinton's vision to sort of increase the size of the department by 25%, including AID, in these 4 years is an important one. But I come back to this issue, as the book does, of for what, and for what capability, and how is the money spent, and will it be spent on new things and important things. I drew several kind of important points from the book that I would just highlight to you from my perspective. First, as Gordon said, and it's on page 1, and it really is the whole point, I think, is that money is policy. And as Bev and I, when we served together, knew, and all of us know in this room, that money is policy, money is policy. And the fact that, as Gordon said, and as I will say in this commentary, that the State Department has not yet grasped this fact in a most important way, holds this institution back. Second really important point is a quotation that the world of international affairs budgeting is characterized by a dispersion of agencies and programs, which is, in my view, a huge disadvantage. Also, I thought very interesting in the book was the historical notion that after World War II, kind of the State Department's culture kind of rose back up and said, we are the people, as the State Department, who have the traditional role as the home of U.S. diplomacy. That the United States diplomats represent the United States overseas. They observe, they report on events. And from this perspective, as the book says, diplomats are not foreign assistance providers, program developers, or managers. And as a result, the book goes on to say, state did not organize itself internally to plan, budget, manage, or implement the broader range of U.S. engagement. And in my view, this is a key point, and a point about, and one of those key things that must change. If you look at the jobs that we're asking people to do today abroad, it isn't any longer about observing and reporting. It is about dealing with sustainable development, pluralism, stopping the trafficking of women and children. All of those things are not done by talking point or by observation. They are done by activity, and those are the kinds of things that people need to do. So I think we will see, I hope that you will see this shift in the department to do more and more of this program management. Another important point, the department operated for decades with a budgeting and planning system that separates operations and administration from program responsibility. And again, a problem with what the book describes as the dominant culture. I'm glad that Gordon talked about the changes that Rich Armitage tried to put in, the effort that Jack Lew is making. I think the QDDR is a very important step forward, and it needs our support because it shows the way to the more culture change that is still needed. And finally, the book's very important focus on AID. And here I want to pay particular homage to Gordon. I worked on the Embassy of the Future report. And when he took on the second report, the Foreign Affairs Budget of the Future, the first thing he said is, we now need to bring AID into this issue and get the right number of people there and refederalize that agency and make it, again, an important part of our foreign policy. A couple of things that I'd like to note that I hope people won't forget, and that is the importance in this chapter and the importance to the United States of economic support funds and the other budgetary tools in Chapter 4. The effort, as Gordon said, to make sure that this coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization is adequately funded. And as an ambassador, I must say I lived on security assistance programs, and I'd pay special attention to the International Military Education and Training budget, IMIT, a tiny part of our national security budget, which may be among the best that America spends overseas. finally, as Gordon and Cindy did, talk about Chapter 11, which is the chapter that makes the recommendations. And I think the focus on the reforms and the focus on the revitalization of aid, the need, very importantly, to sort out the relationship between state and aid is a very important thing. And I think it's worth considering the implications of that Chapter 11 and considering whether it's time to return AID to its prominence by gathering all of the foreign assistance tools, emergency response like OFTA, MCC, PEPFAR, State Department Post of Post-Conflict Reconstruction, into a serious U.S. Agency for International Development. And as they say, the department's got to do a better job on the QDDR. But I return to this fundamental point that diplomacy has utility in the 21st century. It needs to be transformed. It needs to be adequately funded. I say it's not the answer to every question, but I would put to you that it's the answer to many of the challenges that face the United States, and this buying national security is a path forward to make sure that it is properly resourced. So again, I thank you very much. I congratulate you both, and I thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel.
Thank you, Mark. Turn finally to Dov Zakheim, who is the former Undersecretary of Defense for the Comptroller, is currently the Senior Vice President of Booz Allen Hamilton. He was, as I mentioned, the Chief Financial Officer for DOD, and he was the Secretary of Defense's principal advisor on financial and budgetary matters, developing and managing, the world's largest budgets, overseeing all aspects of the department's accounting and auditing system, and negotiating major international defense agreements. So during a particularly traumatic period. So, Del, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Rob. It is a pleasure to be here. Gordon Adams and I go back longer than either of us is prepared to admit anymore. And Cindy was a senior official at one of my favorite institutions in Washington, the Congressional Budget Office, where I started life in this town. Let me say up front, this is an excellent volume. Having read a lot, written a lot, and lived a lot in the budget world, half my professional life, there's nothing like it out there. And practitioners, students, academics, anybody who wants to know about budgets needs to read this book. It's just as simple as that. And it does pull together in a way that no other does all the strands of national security. Gordon's right. I mean, whole of government is just a phrase. And one of the things you learn when you're in government is that the new crowd, any new crowd, comes in with its pet phrases. And so there's a pet phrase. And what the bureaucracy does is, repeat the mantra until there's a new mantra.
Does that include the pronunciation of nuclear as nuclear?
Well, I suppose. I remember many years ago I had an acquaintance in the comptroller's office, and this was at a time when Cap Weinberger was changing comptrollers every year. And this fellow, whenever I had lunch with him, would tell me how wonderful the current comptroller was and how a disaster his predecessor was. So you think about that for a second. So that's so forget the phrases, except one, and that's that the budget is policy. Now, you've heard it 4 times, but I'll tell you a story. When I was talking to Don Rumsfeld about what I would do, there were a number of undersecretary jobs that he could have appointed me to. The only one that I really felt totally unqualified for was the personnel one. So I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, I want you to be the budget guy because the budget is policy. So it's not an academic telling you that. It's the Secretary of Defense telling you that. And that's, I think, a very, very important lesson about how government thinks about budgets. The book is also extremely strong in another way. It's been mentioned kind of in passing, but it's really important. And I know Gordon's doing some more work in this area. And that's culture. What this book tells you is why these agencies approach budgets in such different ways. And that's because their cultures are so fundamentally different. I saw this firsthand, of course, during the early period of the Iraq War, when my friends at the State Department were considered bad guys by some of my friends in the Defense Department, and my friends at the Defense Department were considered knee-jerk ideologues by some of my friends at the State Department. And I say this as somebody who, probably the only guy, certainly in my period, who got a letter of appreciation from the State Department. So, this was not a bias. I mean, I was just hearing this on both sides. That's pretty scary. But it's a function of culture. And it's very important to understand that. And this book makes that very, very, very clear. Let me give you another couple of stories before I get into some down and dirty green eye shade details. I saw Bob McNamara just around the time I was appointed to be comptroller. And I said to him, by the way, we're still using the PPBS. I'll get to PPBE because I'm the guy who added the E. He says, you got to be kidding me. Enough said. The other point is about supplementals. In, I think it was June of 2001, I gave a press conference. We were asking for $5.6 billion as a sup. Your $18.4 billion actually was for 2002, and I've got the Bush memo here so you can clear it up in your next edition. And I announced we would not ask for any more supplementals. And 3 months later, 9/11 happened. And what's really happened with the SUPs is not that there should not have been supplementals in 2002, 3, and 4, maybe even 5, because if you look at the Vietnam War, that's kind of what happened. And the Balkans, it's kind of what happened. But as Senator Byrd pointed out to me and made me squirm in my chair in a hearing, that did not go on endlessly. And the real problem is that because it wasn't ratcheted down, and we've seen how Secretary Gates is really trying to push things into the baseline budget and how hard it is to make it happen. And we're talking about a very, very effective Secretary of Defense. Again, it tells you something about culture. It tells you something about inertia. It also tells you something about Congress, which is another very, very important aspect of this book, where it is not just a book about the executive branch. I'm fond of saying that my colleagues at the State Department in some way function as if they were in the 18th century. The only thing is they don't speak French anymore. But it's still very much a cable culture. And I think Mark Grossman pointed out why it's not just a matter of more money, it's a matter of doing things differently. And I don't need to repeat what he said because I think he said it very well. Well, if state's an 18th century institution, Congress is equally an 18th century institution. Except, unlike state and its current secretary, I haven't seen Congress think about fixing itself up at all. Whereas I think Secretary Clinton and Secretary Rice and Secretary Powell have all, in their way, tried to grapple with the situation and do something that's very hard, which is change the culture. There is no evidence, to me at least, and nothing that jumps out of this book, that tells me that Congress is really trying to change its culture. In fact, what the book tells me is quite the contrary. And that's very important because there's only so much blame you could lay at the door of any executive agency. Now, one example of how hard it is for state to turn itself around. Now, what I'm going to do is talk about the agencies I know best, state and AID, which I dealt with because I was coordinator for Afghanistan as well as comptroller, civilian coordinator, OMB because I had to deal with them, and then the agency I served twice now in my career, DOD. Secretary Gates sent a letter to Secretary Clinton on December 15th, suggesting that state and defense pool their resources so they don't get at each other's throats over how to spend the money for reconstruction. As you heard, Secretary Gates doesn't really want DOD to be the default option every time. And he's right. State has yet to respond. Okay? I doubt it's because of Secretary Clinton, and I doubt it's because of Jack Lew. The system simply has not responded. So here we are in the middle of March, January, February, March, 3 months for a response from the Secretary of State to a letter that clearly was handwritten practically by the Secretary of Defense. One problem there. Another issue beyond state and beyond Congress is OMB. But OMB can be part of a solution. When I was comptroller, one thing I did when state didn't have money for assistance to certain countries is just before the budget closed down, I would kick the money back to OMB, and OMB would turn the money back to state. So we kind of financed state, not in as obvious and headline a way as today, but it was doable. But again, Congress has to be helpful in this. And if Congress isn't going to be helpful, it doesn't really matter what we do. People forget. You submit a budget, but Congress approves the budget. The book tells you that very clearly. And so all this great work and DOD, it's years, as you point out, doesn't mean anything if Congress is going to do what it wants to do. Another example of, I think, states' difficulties is what's called SCRS, which is discussed briefly in the book, which stands for Secretary's Office. That's the S/Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. You would have thought that this should be states' central focus. It has a very good ambassador running the shop, John Herbst, well-meaning guy. Had a lot of trouble getting money out of Congress, and I think you're right about that. But he has his money now. So how many people do you think are in the Civilian Response Corps right now? 90. Actually, a little less. I think it's 89. How many people are in Iraq out of that 90 people? Zilch. How many people are in Afghanistan? 19. How many people are in Panama? There are some. Panama? Wait a minute. When was the last time we were fighting the Taliban in Panama? Why is that happening? Because, as the book tells you, the regional bureaus still have a stranglehold on what really goes on at state. And because John Herbst does not control the money that he had to beg out of Congress and can't allocate it and can't prioritize it and can't budget for it, he can't do what he really wants to do. And then the secretary gets up and says in frustration, actually both of these secretaries, State and Defense, that things are not going the way they want. So it's culture, it's history. Why are there so many accounts in the aid sphere, by the way? Because there are, and you're right about that. It has to do with the nature of the Agency for International Development. Everybody, including Secretary Clinton, acknowledges that AID has become a contracts management shop. And the book talks about that. It doesn't have the people. There's a congressional history behind that. And you cannot just create an operational agency out of a management shop. It doesn't happen overnight. By the way, AID historically has been rather unwilling to work with other agencies, and I'm not sure why. It also has a development culture, and a development culture is very different from what I think Secretary Clinton wants today. I think there's a consensus across the board, Republicans, Democrats, this administration, last administration, state, defense, that in order to pursue what we call smart power today, we have to have a focus on our national security interests, and then we use tools other than just the guys in guns or the women in guns to carry them out. A development culture, on the other hand, essentially says we're altruistic. We'll give money and help people. Now, we do that through the international financial institutions right now, IMF, World Bank, and so on. What you want AID to do is grab that opportunity to really be the focus of smart power. But the culture is one of development. So again, it's hard for people to shift. OMB. I had a wild time dealing with OMB. I wish I had had Gordon Adams in OMB. There is a tendency amongst some OMB staff and people who come into OMB to try to micromanage. Now, when you're talking about DOD, with a lot of people, a lot of money, a lot of programs, and how many people did you have, Gordon? 50, 60, 80, whatever?
Between 50 and 60 when I was there.
All right. So we're talking about what? A few rifle squads? To try to micromanage a $500 billion budget is foolhardy. What happens is that unnecessary frictions are created, the department pushes back, and then mistakes are made. And I'll give you two massive examples, one that unfortunately didn't have ramifications and one did. The one that didn't was when OMB held up for a long time approving F-16s for Poland, to the point where Chris Hill was going out of his mind. He was ambassador at the time. There was no rationale given. It was just held up. The one that had huge ramifications was that OMB decided that because we were focusing on Iraq, we would not put a lot of money into Afghanistan. And had we put a few billion into Afghanistan in the first years, 02 and 03, I'm not sure we'd be where we are today. There's a real issue as to how far into policy OMB should get. Should OMB work with NSC? Absolutely. I think Gordon and Cindy are absolutely right about that. But OMB should be subordinate. It should be the macro implementer. It should not be the micromanager, and it should not see itself as a policy shop. Once it gets out of the bounds of being the macro implementer, invariably there's trouble. CPA was so fed up with OMB, and oh, by the way, the book says that Jerry Bremer reported to the secretary. That was nominal. He also reported to the president, which is
And
why
to
he
the
had
Secretary General. He reported everybody.
he reported everybody, and so that when he threatened to quit, nobody knew who he was going to send us that letter to.
That might be more Jerry than the system.
That might be more Jerry than the system, but a
No
system
comment.
there is a rule of law that was set up by Admiral Rickover, who was a 4-star admiral reporting to a 2-star admiral. When you have 2 bosses, you have no bosses. And Jerry had 2 or 3 or whatever. Anyway, the
Well,
point
let's go
is
with
that
that.
OMB was part of that difficulty, and it needn't have been. So now let me get to DOD very quickly. I was the guy who added the E to execution. It was not really because of performance goals, because those are very hard actually to identify, as you rightly point out. It was simply this. Different programs burn their money. Burn rate is a business term, use up their money at different rates. We have such a multiplicity of programs that obviously some are going to spend more quickly than others. We have an execution review. It's once a year. It's a mid-year execution review. I felt that in the first place, not enough people were paying attention. We were paying constant attention to inputs, but not to outputs. Execution is an output. And again, you guys have written very well about that. So the first thing was to just elevate execution to the equivalent of planning, programming, and budgeting, because execution is what really happens in the real world. The second thing I plumped for, did not succeed, trying again now in my as a member of the Defense Business Board, we just reported out on that, is to have more than one execution review a year. If you have 2 or 3, you know how to put together your mother may I's to the Congress, because anytime you want to shift funds of any significance, I'm talking about a few $1 million, you have to go to the Hill and staffers decide that. So you better be really right about what you're asking for. And secondly, you can manage like a real world firm does what's being spent, what's not being spent, what might be not wasted, what might be saved, and so on. So multiple execution reviews are a good idea. And hopefully maybe the department will pick up on the idea of more than one. You talked about the part. It never really took hold. I think you mentioned that. Again, that's a cultural thing. Something that comes over from the other side of the river, oh boy. The first reaction, and I saw this in the Weinberg administration, I saw this when I was walking in and out of other administrations, the first reaction is, how do we get around it? That's the culture. We know what we want. Those guys really don't. During the Cold War, the big enemy wasn't really the Soviet Union. It was Congress. I mean, it's that kind of thing. SERP. I would just say, again, a good discussion of SERP, except that SERP-like programs actually began before Iraq. They began in the mid-'80s when we were supporting Central America. And I think it's important to make that clear, because you then begin to see how a program that started out with one intention, and even in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were talking about small bucks, 50,000, 60,000, as you say, winds up ballooning so that now you have programs that are greater than $1 million and have to be signed off, I believe, by General McChrystal himself. One last point, foreign military financing. It already also existed in the 1980s. There were also offset programs. The Israelis have their own special deal where you give them the money, they spend it on themselves, and it's our money. It's kind of an interesting thing in itself. DOD gets involved, by the way, in a lot more than just administering military assistance programs. It gets into the policy, and just to go back many, many years, there was a huge debate over selling AWACS to Saudi Arabia in the late 70s. DOD was totally in the middle of that, and it's in the middle of most of these things. I think the book might have drawn that out a little bit more. And again, DOD gets involved in drawdown decisions. Which country gets which system? Everybody wants our systems. They like our used systems because our used systems are still 25 years newer than their systems. And everybody wants them. How do you prioritize? State plays in that. DOD plays in that. Having said all of that, minor nits, I think I'll finish where I began. This is a marvelous book. And I would recommend it to anybody who wants to think at all seriously about budgets, what they're for, how they should be spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov. Let's open it up now for comments and questions from the floor. There's a microphone that's circulated. If speakers could just identify themselves. We'll turn first to Don Wolfensberger. who is director of our Congress project. Knows a lot
Thank you,
about
Don
budget.
Wolfensberger. Thank you, Gordon and Cindy, for a wonderful presentation, also for some good commentary from both of the commentators. I was thinking when you all mentioned that you thought things were pretty bad at defense until you started looking at how some of the other departments did it, and coming from the Hill and working up there for so many years, the thing that I kept getting back from people in other committees, I was on more of a leadership committee, but was that the Defense Department people were the best organized, the best disciplined in their presentations to Congress, whereas the other people didn't know what they were doing or what they were saying, and yet I think maybe a lot of that was spurred by the inner rivalry between the various agencies at the defense. They were really competing to impress Congress, and they were vying for funds there. But in any event, that was one thing that struck me from what you said. But then looking at something that someone just raised with me within the last week or so was that there's been a shift in emphasis at the Appropriations Committee, and this was with respect to transportation, but they said it's happening elsewhere too, and that is that the Appropriations Committee is looking more at general policy themes than they are going deeper into the weeds the way they used to with people that are further down in the various sub-cabinet departments and agencies and so on. To me, that's stepping on the shoes of the authorizers. On the other hand, perhaps it's a good thing, and I would just like to get your reaction as to how Congress looks at budgeting, whether and what your recommendations are for improving its ability to oversee how funds are spent, how they're planned to begin with, and so on.
Well, I have to say on the defense side, they still do get down into the weeds. I was just checking yesterday what was going on in terms of hearings related to defense. And in the Veterans Affairs and Military Construction Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee on, I think this is on the Senate side, but I may have the chamber confused. They were holding hearings on the Arlington National Cemetery, right? They were holding hearings on some things that are really way down in the weeds. And that, to me, tells me they're taking an interest in things still that are pretty far down in the weeds. The same kind of thing goes on for the defense subcommittees in both chambers. There this week, I think, hearing from the combatant commanders, so they're taking an interest at least at that level. They're planning to do pretty big scrubs. One of the other things I'm noticing is that the budget committees in the two chambers are starting to take an interest in defense and giving some consideration to whether defense should hold on to the same, actually a small rise in real terms that the administration is asking for. So my sense is you're starting to see some scrub even in the budget resolution process. I will mention, because you mentioned the discipline of the speakers who come in from defense and testify on the budgets, and how much knowledge they have of what's going on inside their budgets and how well they're able to justify their budgets. I think when people look at the defense PPBE and they notice that defense continues to allocate by budget shares, right? So that the four services are getting about the same share of the budget as they had during the Cold War. A lot of people sort of start crying and say, gee, that the process, the PPBE must not work at all because there is no central control. And one of the things I've noticed is that a disciplined process is what leads to this kind of information. It leads to information that people in oversight positions, whether they're in the department, in the administration, or on the Hill, can use to make better decisions. So if that's all that's happening, if all that's happening is that this PPBE is forcing people to come up with the information and reveal that information, I would say it's a good thing.
Now, let me come in from a slightly different direction. I agree with what Cindy had to say. Both Mark and Dove made points about culture, and I think in terms of the way the departments relate to the Hill, culture is an overwhelmingly important explanation of the difference that you see when you go up to the Hill and realize that It's littered with people who are either detailees or defense or service briefers, and the presentations are crisp. They're focused on the budget. The budget requirements are very clearly laid out, and it's a major target. Culturally, this has not been a significant focus of the State Department. When I was at OMB, I was struck repeatedly with two things. One was, by and large, the department did not take its congressional relationship overall terribly seriously. And number two, when it did take it seriously, it targeted the authorizers. So from a Hill point of view, the committee that was getting the focus of attention from H, the Ledge Office in the State Department, was the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and to some extent the House Foreign Affairs Committee, two of the weakest committees in the budgetary process in the Congress. So it wasn't helping the resource approach for the department very much. For the centerpiece of their legislative thrust when they took it seriously, to be focused on their authorizing committees, which had virtually no role, or at best a modest one, to play in any allocation of resources. The appropriations process was not a process people knew. And the other half of the cultural thing, and I don't want to get in trouble with my good friend and colleague Mark Grossman here, but by and large, Foreign Service officers are not trained to the budgetary arts, which means even when you send your average Foreign Service officer, and Mark's very much an exception to this, to the Hill to talk requirements and details on programs, they can't do it with the skill that your average decent Hill briefer from the Department of Defense or the services can do it. So there's a huge cultural issue inside the agencies itself. The other comment I wanted to make, Don, is that the stovepiping on the Hill is, and I think I agree with Dov here, this is an 18th century institution, and the stovepiping has not changed dramatically since the 1860s when the appropriations committees were created. Oh, the names and labels have changed somewhat, but the stovepiping has not changed particularly. The only time in my lifetime when the Hill was a centerpiece of thinking about the coherent relationship from an expenditure point of view amongst the various agencies, not just national security, was when there was pay-go and caps. When you were in a budget deficit reduction discipline and the caps on discretionary spending were binding, then the budget committee's role on the Hill was significantly enhanced, and the budget committees could then look at these, to the degree they did, in a more overarching way across agencies. Once that discipline eroded and then disappeared in 2002, the natural stovepiping of the appropriations subcommittees reasserted itself. Frankly, from my point of view, the only really positive development in terms of reform since that time on the Hill has been finally the decision to merge the state piece of Commerce, Justice, State with the foreign operations piece in the appropriations committee. So you now actually have at least a context. I don't think they've grappled with it as an entity yet, but you have the context within which a single appropriations subcommittee can deal with virtually all of the elements that go into the Function 150 account. So that's a step forward, but it's a baby step. The stovepiping problem is really an enormous obstacle in the way the Hill deals with these accounts.
Okay, woman here. Microphone's coming.
Hi, Rachel Oswald from Center for International Relations. I really appreciate the enormity of what you guys have tackled here in dealing with the process of the budget. But I'm curious, to what extent were you able to find out the trend over the last couple of decades, I think beginning with Reagan, of subbing out work to contractors as a cost efficiency measure? Has there been any attempt to really look at that? Has this saved the government money? How efficacious is it now? Certainly there are lots of media reports about defense contractors like Blackwater and Assorted, or huge cost overruns with contractors in Iraq. Did your research touch on this?
The book doesn't talk about this. There has obviously been a shift of work from people who are inside the government, either say in the Department of Defense, people who wear the uniform, or defense civilians, over to contractors. And there have been some studies of both the efficacy and the cost. And when the Department of Defense has commissioned studies of what's going on with not the people who are on the leading edge of the fight on the battlefield, but just the ones at home, as work got transferred, say, bookkeeping or work that's done to maintain buildings on base, that kind of work. There were genuine savings from shifting work from the government to the private sector. Now, one of the reasons that those savings came was that the way to do that, when work already existed and was already being done in-house, was a competition in every case. You had to have a private-public competition. And just the act of competition in many cases made the government workers more efficient, the government team more efficient than it had been. But also, if the work ended up being turned over to a contractor, on average about 30 to 40% was saved. Now, people ask whether that can go on. Will they continue to save as much money? Say you chose a contractor competitively, and that contractor now is doing all of the painting on base, the painting of the buildings on base. The next time around, the program manager may like that contractor and be a little bit reluctant to genuinely open to competition. And so you may see less of an effect from competition in the private sector after you've gone through that a couple of times. So people are concerned about that. They're also concerned that even though you got those savings in early runs at this, you wouldn't get them later because you might have already taken the low-hanging fruit, the jobs that are easy to compete where there is a genuine competitive marketplace outside the base. So for those kinds of reasons, people aren't sure that that can persist. Now, there's a different story when you come to the contractors, say, who are supporting the fight in Iraq, either the service contractors who handle logistics, cooking the food, doing the laundry, or the private security contractors. And the Congressional Budget Office has done some work to try to figure out, are the costs about the same, are they worse? And basically what they found with a private security contractor was that if you look at the overall contract and compare that with the military units that would otherwise have carried out that work, it's about a wash. It's about equal in cost. But that's costs at this moment. And the difference is that once the wars are over, you won't need the private security contractors, and you can fire them, and you won't have to continue to pay their costs as you would if it had been a military unit.
Let me just add to that, because I sit on the Commission on Wartime Contracting for Afghanistan and Iraq. And I would commend to you, we've already issued a major interim report and some flash reports and had a lot of hearings, and so I would commend to you looking at those reports, and you can probably get the hearings on video. Two other issues in addition to what Cindy just raised. One is the whole question of what's inherently governmental. And the administration itself, the government itself, is grappling with this, and it's not a new issue. What is meant to be for the government to do and no one else? There's a huge gray area there. And there seems to be now a movement toward a better definition, but it is one that has truly exercised the government for many years. The second issue is one of oversight. There's a consensus that there is a shortage of contracting officer representatives in the field. That has to do with a whole lot of reasons that I don't want to waste your time right now about. But obviously, if you don't have enough government officials carrying out oversight, then what do you expect?
I just follow up on that. I mean, one area of oversight is the executive office of the president. And I think what's striking to most people is that when you talk about the NSC, there are very few like actual NSC employees. Everyone's on detail. The council, the NSC's used the Council on Foreign Relations fellows. I mean, it's like a very bizarre to most outsider ways of kind of staffing up that very critical operation. Now presidents have used NSCs operationally. That's been problematic, but they have been, I mean, really within the four corners of the charter is sort of monitoring implementation of policies like the USG policy is not to disband the Iraqi army, you know, and then things happen. So, I mean, could you just comment on that budget piece of funding that branch and then its role in terms of what was just discussed?
Yeah, I think the problem with the NSC, I mean, let me separate this from the NSC piece from the OMB piece. The problem with the NSC is that the NSC is nothing that the president doesn't want it to be. So NSC is not a permanent office. It doesn't have a large permanent staff. It could staffed largely by detailees, and its annual budget's probably in the area of $7 or $8 million a year. It's very small, right? In terms of mission, if you go back to the 1947 National Security Act, you couldn't even define what the mission of the NSC was. It's one of the shortest legislative texts establishing an organization that we know. So that you don't, every president has used it differently. Eisenhower tended to use it quite operationally. He had an operational side, he had a strategic planning side. Even that tended to disintegrate late in the Eisenhower presidency. Kennedy said, I don't want this institution to do anything. I'm going to have my own guys around me, and that's the way I'm going to handle national security planning. So every president has tended, right up until we get largely to George Herbert Walker Bush, has tended to use NSC idiosyncratically. Henry Kissinger used it to support Henry Kissinger. Everybody has had a peculiar way of handling the NSC, and the architecture that we're familiar with today, regional senior directors, functional senior directors, some kind of interagency group, whether you call it a PCC or an IWIG or whatever it was called, deputies committees, principals committees. That's really not that old as an architecture in American history. Its function has historically largely been to do the president's schedule. That's when the president's going to meet with somebody or go on a trip. NSC is tasked with that. To do firefighting when crises come up and problems need to be dealt with at the presidential level because they're major importance to the White House. And the occasional interagency working group. It's not been a policy planning organization. It hasn't had a strategic planning capability. It has a small office now, probably for the first time. So it's not a strategic planning organization. And I would say it has virtually no capacity, skill, or tasking in what you're asking, which is how is policy actually being implemented? What's actually happening here? Do we get performance? Do we know that it's happening? To the degree that happens in the White House, it's OMB. Right? OMB has the 450 permanent civil servants who work for any administration that comes in. They know how the entire operation of the government is done. They have a management side which is actually tasked in the procurement area, for example, in setting government-wide procurement policies. And they have an examiner staff in the resource management organizations, which in theory, if they weren't so busy doing budgeting and firefighting, could be doing this oversight tasking. And I give them credit for this, the part exercise was a difficult exercise, but between the JIPRA of 1993 and the part exercise, the resource management organizations at OMB actually engaged on the issue of, are you doing what you said you were going to do? What are the performance measurements? Let's come around the next time and see if you actually accomplished it. And, there was a lot of hair pulling in agencies. I've referred to some of it about, oh, my God, these guys are in our hair again. They're telling us what to do and how to do it. And some of the part exercise, I would say probably not so much part as the president's management agenda, which was a separate sort of scorekeeping exercise on agencies. That was visibly political, visibly not a very serious management exercise. Part was actually a more serious management exercise, in my judgment. It tended to burn time. I see Mike Casella here, he knows very well. It tended to burn examiners' time to a fare thee well because OMB had to be the agency that did it, right? So to the degree you have that kind of implementation oversight, you have it at OMB. Dove is quite right. What you don't have at OMB, and policy is not its primary mission, is even a long-term strategic planning capability on the resource side. So if you wanted NSC to play an overarching strategic planning role or an implementation role, or OMB to do a long-term strategic planning role and implementation role, even hip to hip, you'd have to create two capabilities that do not currently exist in the organizations.
Let's try to get a couple questions, and then we'll give our panel a final opportunity. These two gentlemen here. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the excellent presentations. Mike Kraft, and I had worked for on budget issues for a while in the State Department Counterterrorism Office. For my various sins, I got involved in bureau performance plans and that, maybe because I took a creative writing course in college, and they found out. And I was curious, Gordon, particularly how much in dealing with priorities, what were the trend lines in terms of NSC weighing in? I mean, for example, even after 9/11, and despite the emphasis on terrorism, we would find that OMB would cut the requests on the anti-terrorism training assistance programs, which are kind of hard to delve into. And you mentioned the Bureau performance plans was very consistent, paying attention to it, because we got the impression the congressional appropriators did not deal with it. And on the defense side, how do you deal with the conflicting priorities? Say, let me take an example, even with the Air Force. Early in my career, I served on a staff of a senior member of the Senate Appropriations Committee. We got into these issues of like how many F-15s should be approved, vis-a how many F-16s, etc., which even those of us that had a little bit of an engineering background found very hard to deal with. And I kind of wondered how OMB gets into these priority issues on the trade-offs between, say, one set of hardware or another, or various aspects of the NATO program.
Let me take a couple of.
Could you just pass the microphone forward to?
You want to take the questions
Let's
together?
just take a
Sure.
final round.
No problem.
And then.
I'm Mike Casella. As Gordon mentioned, I used to be one of his micromanagers at OMB, now at Millennium Challenge Corporation, and
to be.
Yeah, soon to be at USAID. And my question is, I completely agree with the focus on agency culture, having experienced it more on the state and AID, and soon to really experience it on the AID side. And my question is, how do you change culture in state and AID when the agencies are managed largely by an institution, the Foreign Service, which is designed to perpetuate its culture to a large degree? And I guess I'd also ask the question, I think it's a different situation at DoD, but again, managed in many ways by the military, which is equally, if not more so, designed to perpetuate its culture. And the context for my question is looking at a place like the NCC, where by necessity, we had to bring people in at mid and upper levels from all over the place: government, NGOs, think tanks, multilateral institutions, lots of different private sector institutions. And that has, if anything, that's led to the opposite problem, which is no agency culture. So you've got competing cultures in every office and every division, but at least we constantly get new ideas floating into the institution. I think that's a huge issue that I've observed at State and Aid, that you simply don't have that flow of new experiences. And since the Foreign Service is going to continue to manage these institutions, what can you do in terms of Foreign Service reform or other ideas that would help get at that question?
Okay. This gentleman here, that'll be the final question, and then we'll turn it over to the panel. Just got a few minutes left, so please be brief.
Yeah, Chachin, freelance correspondent. I will come to a different angle. I think the basic problem is no accountability and no transparency. And I know everybody is reforming how they deal with this problem. Thank you.
Why don't we go to the commentators for any last comments they'd like to make, and then we'll give the authors the last word. Any?
We'll just go down the table, I guess.
Yeah.
Let me deal with the question about changing culture. DOD's culture and power balances changed significantly with Goldwater Nichols. When I first served in DOD, I remember and I used to sit on the Defense Resources Board, as it was then called. I remember the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff begging for a little bit of money for command and control. And everybody would nod to him because he was the chairman, and nobody would pay attention and nobody would give any money. Obviously, that's not the case today, and it wasn't the case when Colin Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Why are the Joint Chiefs so powerful today? Why are the combatant commanders so much more powerful than their predecessors, the SINCs, were, the commanders-in-chief? What Goldwater Nichols did was change the measurements and reward system. And as soon as you change the measurements and reward system, as soon as people in uniform find out you're not going to be an admiral, you're not going to be a general unless you serve on the Joint Staff, instead of the Joint Staff being the dead end for people who were then going to retire, which is what it was in the 80s and 70s, it became the place where the best and the brightest came to. You want to change the State Department? You change the measurement and reward system. You insist that in order to get promoted to, say, ministerial rank, you have to have done something, say, in the programming and budgeting sphere. Otherwise, you won't get promoted. And I guarantee you, because they're all really bright, energetic people, they'll turn on a dime. The difficulty has been that in order to do things like that, you need congressional support. And Goldwater Nichols basically happened because a few staffers, Jim Locker, a couple of others, fought for years. It took them about 5 years to get this thing to pass. I don't see that happening right now in the foreign policy community of Congress. But if you want to change the AID culture, you want to change the state culture, that's what you need.
Great comment. Thanks. Mark?
Thank you very much. Let me just make 4 quick comments all along. First, I think it's important just to recognize, I think Dov is right about the question of how many people from the Office of Stabilization and Reconstruction at the State Department in Iraq, but I think we ought to pay tribute to the people at the State Department who are at the embassy in Iraq, which is large and full of people, and people who are there and also in Afghanistan. Second, I think very importantly the point that Gordon made about the challenge of the State Department culture in Congress. It's huge. And something that definitely needs to be dealt with. When I think that, and it wasn't until Colin Powell that we opened our first offices on the Hill. It's astonishing when you think about the effort that others were making. And it wasn't until Powell came and said, get these people up there and put them on the Hill, and let's let people show something from the culture. Second, I think that this is the congressional piece of this is a really important piece of what has to change. And as Gordon said, it's dealing with authorizers, it's appropriators. And when I think of the change that's coming, some of it will be forced, I think, by the kind of new jobs that are being done. For example, when I think about Plan Colombia required, first of all, the State Department to work with other people. It required people to go and make sense to appropriators. It required people to work with the Defense Department. And I think there are more and more efforts like Plan Colombia, not in terms of structure, coming. And I hope that will do something to knit some of these things together and change some of that culture. Third point I'd make is on contracting. And I just wanted to just say that the points Dov made are extremely important. One, contractors are going to be around for a while. They're not going to go away because of the decisions we've made as a country about how many people we want to have in various agencies. We want to have a draft. We don't have too many people at the State Department. So they're going to be contractors. But crucially, as Doug said, this is especially true of the State Department, is the question of supervision. And so what's wrong with this vision is not that there are contractors, it's not that there's anybody to supervise them. And when the department came along, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, it found 4 or 5 people in whole offices to deal with billions and billions of dollars. And I think at one point, Dov was nice enough to send us over 140 contracting officers to see if we could get on top of some of this issue. And so this is really a question of supervision. And final point here is this issue of what is inherently governmental. And what that comes to for the State Department is the protection of people abroad. And do you give that to people who are not employees of the government? And I think there's an argument that says the people who shoot on behalf of the government of the United States ought to be in the chain of command of the government of the United States. Finally, question of culture. 3 points. One is the culture of the State Department's got to change. First, I think that I would be that we would be in favor of something like Goldwater Nichols for the department, no question about it. And I was hoping that the PNSR would kind of be part of that. But that's got to happen because, as Dov said, the incentive system would then be torqued and very important. Second really important thing is the job of the State Department is changing. And I think that is something that I hope will therefore change the culture. And third, where this all knits together, is because of the efforts of people like Gordon Adams and others, there's a large number of people coming into the State Department. And what do you know about these people? They're different than the people who came before. They want different things. They feel different ways about their job. They want to be doing different things that people have done over the last 30 or 40 years. And so it is the capacity of helping them essentially be revolutionaries in this new culture, which I hope will take this department to the next level.
Cindy?
So let me take up this issue of transparency that was raised in the last question, because I think transparency in many ways is just phenomenal today. You can go on the internet and you can pull up the Defense Department's budget at a relatively useful level. You can see what's spent on procurement, and you can see a history track in their online green book for what was spent on procurement, on research, development, test and evaluation, you name it, for decades. So to me, that's very transparent. The Department of Homeland Security publishes online its budget in brief annually. And if you are of a mind to look at the footnotes, you can find all kinds of stuff about the current budget, and you can go back to previous ones to find out things about earlier budgets. So that's all good. The one place where I still have trouble as an analyst piecing things together is if I look at the non-Department of Homeland Security work. The work that's done in the Health and Human Services or the work that's done in the Justice Department, it's hard for me to pull together. I can see from the documents online how much is spent in toto in those agencies and by what the administration calls Homeland Security missions. But I can't get down into a level of detail that I'd like. But to compensate for that, you have outside organizations that are doing an amazing job through Freedom of Information Act requests and just by dint of keeping things from year to year in databases and pulling them together for you. Gordon's is a perfect example. Gordon's group at the Stimson Center makes all kinds of information available. There's a group at the Center for Non-Proliferation and something. Yes, and arms control that does a wonderful job pulling together what's spent in the Homeland Security area of biodefense. So there are things, there are ways to get, I think, an amazing read on what's going on in the budgets.
I guess I'm clean up here, so be brief. Let me just take three of the issues. I want to close on the issue that Mark and Dov both talked to, I think, very eloquently. But first, with respect to the question asked about OMB and interagency and hardware choices and the like, just very briefly, the problem with really having a White House that can set priorities, analyze what programs are appropriate to them, and oversee the assignment of resources is that there is no requirement they do so, no capability at NSC to do so, and an insufficient staff at OMB to staff such a decision process if it actually existed. I draw those conclusions in large part from the one exercise that I am familiar with, which was, I think, one you referred to, the National Implementation Plan for Counterterrorism, which was actually not run at NSC, it was run at NCTC, well into it with a kind of a chapeau at NSC with the Deputy Administrator, a National Security Advisor at NSC, but which turned out a cross-agency document on terrorism priority with something like 600 different taskings and had absolutely no process for ensuring that guidance was properly given to agencies overseen in their budget process and overseen in the implementation. My knowledge of this was that there were two people at OMB responsible for that, one internal, one external, international domestic, and they had day jobs. This wasn't all that they did, right? So there was nothing built in the requirement to do a national implementation plan that said you shall enforce this through the budget process. So it was ad hoc, and that's the best process that we probably had interagency from the White House. Secondly, on what about involvement in hardware choices? Just anecdotally, I have to say what really struck me when I went into OMB in '93 was that I came in as somebody who knew a lot about hardware choices and R&D and the metal bending side of the Department of Defense's work. Most all of the issues I dealt with for 5 years at OMB were on the HR side or on the contracting side. I mean, and I don't mean contract awarding. I mean contract implementation, contract management, procurement management, healthcare programs, payroll programs, retirement benefits. I mean, just one thing after another, which are actually critical. They're actually the spinal architecture of what defense does. The weapons buying is a nice to have. That's what makes the building function. So you spend most of your time there. I could recount for you probably on one hand the number of serious, detailed, in-depth OMB engagements on hardware programs at defense that I had a hand in 5 years. It is really not the centerpiece of what OMB does in defense. Finally, let me just underline something, and I think it's core to the discussion here today. The HR problem at state USAID, I have come to conclude, is 75% of the problem. And I don't just mean enough people. I really mean what Dov and Mark have been talking about. Who do you bring in? What skill sets do you look for? When they get there, what kind of training do they get? Do they get cross-the-board training? Do they get it across career training? They don't now. Do they get cross-career training? Do they have rotational career assignments? So they have to go to DOD, go to Justice, go to Ag, go somewhere, AID, wherever. And you don't do that, as Dov says, unless you tick a box. So you get promoted up that chart at the State Department, there got to be a box in there that says, yep, did that. Okay, gets rewarded for it. So everything from recruitment to training to career path to promotional architecture and incentives is, I think, 75% of reforming the State Department in face of the kind of new interagency and international dilemmas we have.
Thank you, Gordon. In Washington, they say always have an exit strategy. Let me tell you about yours tonight. Our exit is closed at 5:30, so you have to walk past it and then past the frieze of Woodrow Wilson into the main Ronald Reagan building, the mothership, and then there's a guard station. You can see how you will exit. Please join me in thanking our speakers today for an excellent presentation.